to talk to you. Start this thing off talking about behavioral economics. This is perhaps a bit of a self-serving statement, but I think behavioral economics really is all economics, because economics is all about the choices people make, why they make those choices, how it influences other people's choices, and ultimately how it determines how people behave. The distinction is that in traditional economics, we have this idea that you ask, how do people behave? Well, they behave rationally, which is that they make choices which are in their best interests. But behavioral economics says, well, it's a little more complicated than that. There are emotional reasons that go into the choices people make. There are social reasons. There are psychological things. All of these things can influence the choices we make, and sometimes it makes us behave in a way that we could say is irrational. So clearly, the first thing I need to do is define for you what it means to behave irrationally. This is Gallatin, so I'm going to use a literary example. I'm going to go with Shakespeare and talk about Richard III and Hamlet. So, for those of you who don't remember, Richard III comes out at the beginning of his play with a great little soliloquy where he says, war is over, we have peace now, everything's going to be wonderful, we can put down our weapons and all go get girlfriends. But unfortunately for Richard, he's ugly and crippled and not really good at the whole girlfriend thing. So he says, and therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasure of these days. So how is Richard going to be a villain? Well, his way to be a villain is kill everyone that stands between him and the throne of England, including his brother and two of his nephews, who are very young. So Richard faced a choice. He could murder his way to the throne, which for him is a great way to be a villain. It gets him some power. This sounds like the sort of thing he's into. He could also calmly enjoy his family and his nephew's company, which may be good for some people, but Richard, he makes it very clear to us, he doesn't do calm. This isn't his thing. So I think based on what he did, he really made quite a rational choice. Now, but I want to make something clear. I want to take a digression a bit to tell you what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that if any of you happen to be in the line of succession to a throne, you should go kill everyone in your way. Because first of all, I imagine most of you have a distaste for killing. You don't really like the idea of that. Also, because like Richard, you probably have to kill people in your family, and you probably get an emotional enjoyment out of their company, and would rather have that emotional enjoyment than having the throne. And I want to point out that although we often talk about emotional and rational as though they're opposites, they don't have to be. Although the emotional enjoyment you get from things like your family's company and not being a murderer aren't exactly tangible, they're still very real, and there's nothing irrational about acting on them. I say, however, that Richard acted rationally because he makes it very clear that his interests don't lie with the family, they don't lie with these emotional things, they lie with the power and being a villain. Now, on to Hamlet. Again, for those of you who don't remember, Hamlet's father is killed by his uncle, who then marries his mother, which is kind of weird. And then his father's ghost visits him and says, hey, your uncle killed me, you need to avenge my death, and above all, you have to remember this, remember me. And Hamlet says, remember thee, yea, from the table of my memory I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, all saws of books, all forms, all pressures past, that youth and observation copied there, and thy commandment alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain. So Hamlet makes it very clear that really nothing could be more important to him than avenging his father's death. And he even comes up with this great plan for how to do it. He's going to have a play performed that reenacts the scene of his father's death, see how his uncle reacts to it. And if his uncle gets very emotional to it, that'll be a sign that he is guilty, he really did do it, it's time to kill and avenge my father's death. So Hamlet, again, faces a choice. Much like Richard, he could execute his cunning plan to expose his uncle's guilt and avenge his father's death. He's pretty much said nothing can be more important to himself than this. He could also kill himself. I mean, maybe there's some validity to that, but I feel like he pretty much told us the first one should be more important. So I think the obvious choice is go with the first one, the cunning plan. Hamlet has to stop and think about it. So this, I think, is a great example of irrational behavior. And the reason I say that, and I want to stop and say what I'm really saying is, it's all about your personal preferences. What's rational for Richard III isn't necessarily rational for Hamlet. What's rational for me isn't necessarily rational for you. Now, this may make you think, well, if you define it that way, when do people ever behave irrationally? Because why would someone ever do something that they don't think is good for them? Well, to try to show you how this can happen, I'm going to show you a list here from a book called Nudge by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler that talks about these issues. This is a list of decisions, features of decisions that tend to be made irrationally. If you have a separation in costs and benefits, where you pay costs now and get benefits later, or vice versa, that makes it harder to decide. If decisions are difficult, mainly if they're more complex, if there's a lot of intermoving parts, you're not always sure what's going to happen. If they're not something that you do frequently, you might make a mistake because practice makes perfect. If you don't get good feedback, that makes it hard to clarify. And finally, perhaps most importantly, you have to know what you like, because sometimes you're not always totally sure. To try to make this more concrete, I'm going to talk about two decisions. One is whether or not to put mustard on a hot dog that you're going to eat. And another is how much of your money to save and where to save it. The mustard question, I won't go through point by point, but I think that should be relatively straightforward. You probably know whether or not you like mustard. You know what you're going to get with mustard on a hot dog. And I also want to point out about the benefits thing. You do get the benefits immediately from the mustard. I didn't make the decision whether or not to have the hot dog, because then you get into a sticky issue about you get the benefits of the tasty hot dog now, but maybe you have a heart attack later. That one's a little trickier. I'm trying to keep this simple now. The saving question, though, much more difficult. First of all, this is the classic example of a decision where you pay the costs right up front, but you don't get the benefits till years down the road. Second of all, it's difficult because there's just so many options. You could save 10% of your money, you could save 20%, you could save 15%. You could put it in stocks, you could put it in bonds, you could put it in mutual funds, you could put it in a bank account, you could keep it under your mattress. There's a lot to choose from. It's probably not something that you do very often. You don't get much feedback because you don't really see how much money you're going to make, again, till years down the road. And finally, your preferences are pretty unclear about it because you don't really know right now, at least if you're around my age, how much money you're going to need when you retire, or how much money you're going to want when you retire. And so it's very difficult to make this decision. So having established, giving you an idea of what irrationality is, we have to talk about the consequences. And I think the practical consequences are fairly obvious. If someone could walk up to you and tell you, hey, you're doing things that you don't want to do, that you very clearly think are bad for you, you would be interested in hearing about that. The theoretical consequences, though, are a little more subtle, but I think maybe even more severe. And it goes to that thing I said about the unknown preferences. You don't always know what you want. You don't always know what the value of something is to you. And the reason this is so important, to explain is I kind of have to go back to the beginning in economics. And in economics, the beginning is Adam Smith. In 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, which really kind of inaugurated the discipline. There's a lot of things from that book that economists still talk about that are still very relevant. There's some other things that have been improved upon. One of those things is the idea of intrinsic value, which is the idea that value is inherent to a good. And it doesn't matter what your perspective is, it doesn't matter what your beliefs about that good has a certain amount of value. Smith in particular said it stemmed from the labor required to make the good. So for example, if it took 5 man-hours to make the chair that you're sitting on, that chair is worth 5 man-hours, and nothing can change that. But in modern economics, we've kind of moved away from this. We have this idea of subjective value, which is that the value of a good is what it's worth to a person. And this can vary from person to person. For example, consider a car. If you live in Manhattan, things are relatively close together. There's a very good public transportation system. You can probably get around without a car. Probably, it may not have that much value to you. However, if you live in Los Angeles, things are very spread apart. There isn't much public transportation. That car becomes much more valuable. So most likely, the same car will be more valuable to a person in Los Angeles than a person in New York. But remember what I said earlier, that you don't always know what the value of something is to you. So I think this is a bit of a paradox here, where you have, on one hand, we're saying the value of something is dependent on what you think it is. On the other hand, we're saying a lot of times you don't know. I like to say that at the intersection of behavioral economics and the subjective theory of value, there is chaos. And more importantly, this chaos reflects itself in uncertainty. There is always just extreme uncertainty about what the proper values of things are, what the right values of things are. If nothing else, just the fact that you have this uncertainty of how things are going to play out in the future always becomes a factor. And in many other ways, it becomes an even bigger factor. So the uncertainty makes it very difficult for us to know values, and because of that, it makes it difficult for us to do things about irrational behavior, which is the final thing I want to talk about. What can we do about this? Well, like I said, it's very tough to deal with because there's so much uncertainty, so we don't really know who knows the best values to go by, because you need some values if you're going to tell people that they're being irrational. One approach that tries to get around this idea is in the book Nudge, which I mentioned earlier. The idea behind that is basically, don't force people to make certain decisions, but try to figure out what you think people want to do and gently push them that way. Always give them the chance to back out, but see if they go the way you try to push them. I'm going to try an experiment to give you an example of a nudge. How many people here, if I told you there was something you could do that only takes a few minutes and would help save lots of lives by increasing the supply of organs, would do it? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you have signed up to be organ donors? Fewer hands. Don't feel bad if you haven't. That just makes you like most people. One sample nudge they propose to deal with that particular problem is make organ donation opt out rather than opt in. So make it when you sign up for your driver's license, you're automatically considered an organ donor unless you say, wait, I don't want to do that. It is a nudge because you have the way to back out, which kind of minimizes this problem of who knows best. But it would most likely increase the percentage of organ donors. However, this isn't a perfect solution because, again, while it minimizes this question of who knows best, the question still exists. We still are making the assumption that it's better for you to be an organ donor. Now, maybe in a question like that, it's not such a hard assumption, but again, to go back to the example of how much money you should save, that could be a much thornier issue of what's best for people. To be very topical, health insurance, which we have recently decided everyone should be required to own. Perhaps that's a good decision, but clearly it's a very contentious decision. Furthermore, nudge solutions don't always exist. I made this slide about a week ago, and ever since then, I've been trying to think of a way, how could you nudge house prices down? Because clearly, we're in a bit of a mess here because people kept paying more and more and more for houses and kept expecting the price to go up. If we could have nudged prices down, that could have been very helpful, but I'm not entirely sure how to do that. And finally, and I'd like to close with this point, there's the question of who implements nudges. Now, for these rather grand things, it would probably be the government, which, at least in this country, is composed of people we elect, who are voted for. But I want to bring back the list of things that tend to imply irrational decisions. This list of things, to me, sounds kind of like voting. And so I think that is a decision where you are very likely to be irrational, and you are likely to have leaders elected on the basis of irrational decisions, and then ask them to try to correct other irrational decisions. And I leave you with this somewhat cynical point to just make the point that behavioral economics is pretty popular right now. Cass Sunstein, who co-wrote Nudge, was appointed to the head of the Regulatory Commission by President Obama, in large part because of the fame from the book. A lot of people are seeing it as something that can fix a lot of problems. And I think there's a lot of great things we can learn from it. And I think it can fix some of our problems. But I think we always need to remember the world is not divided into the rational and the irrational. We're all irrational. And if we try to approach it with this idea of people behave irrationally, we need to make them rational, we're going to slip up because we're irrational too, and we don't always know what the right way to push people towards is. Thank you.